Okay, good morning everyone. First of all, I would like to thank Professor Karni and the organizers for inviting me. It's really an honor to be here and to talk. Ari has asked me to give kind of an introductory talk. So it's going to be an introduction to the terms of procedural and declarative memory, but it's going to be a big critical review of the work of the last 35 years since these terms were coined by Cohen and Squire in their science paper in the 1980s. And as you can see, it was the dissociation between declarative and procedural memory was based on work with amnesic patients. And from the abstract you can read with me, amnesia seems to spare information that is based on rules or procedures as contrasted with information that is database or declarative, knowing how versus knowing that. Okay, this paper was very highly cited, and we have now a tradition of 35 years with these terms, and many of you probably know this diagram from Squire in various versions, basically trying to say that on the one hand we have the declarative system, which is mediated by the mid-temporal regions, primarily the hippocampus and the area surrounding the hippocampus, and the procedural memory, which is primarily subserved by the basal ganglia and other regions like cerebellum. Okay, so on the one hand, this dissociation was very, very important and really contributed a lot to the literature to our understanding of memory systems. But still there are many, many inconsistencies, and I'm trying my talk today to point out to one source of that contributes maybe to the inconsistencies. So first of all, let me give you just two quick examples of studies that within the same paradigm has tried to contrast procedural and declarative memory. One is a behavioral one, and the other one is neuroimaging. Using the probabilistic judgment task, basically the subject here is presented with 1, 2, or 3 cards, all kinds of combinations, and each one of them predicts with a certain probability whether the weather is going to be sunny or rain, and the person is given a feedback. So there is, the person, of course, the subject is unaware of this probabilistic table, and the person receives, gets feedback, and based on this feedback has to learn, or expected to learn, the rule. And what Norton and from the Squires have demonstrated a very nice dissociation, or actually in Teuber's terminology, a double dissociation, that you see that the control groups are learning and the amnesic groups are learning about the same rate. And we have two Parkinson's disease patients, 2 levels of severity, but we see that both around the 50%, which is basically chance. So here you see that amnesic patients are, with the task itself, their performance is preserved, and the patients with Parkinson's disease are impaired. However, when you look into the declarative aspect of the task, in which they actually ask the subject about some information about the task, about the cards, and which requires declarative memory, here you see that the amnesic patients are very impaired, and the Parkinson's patients are preserved. So it's really nice double dissociation that supports the distinction between procedural and declarative memory. Using the same task, Ras Polbrak has conducted an fMRI study. He had a version of, the procedural task is exactly the same. It's a probabilistic judgment task. But now he also added a component of really pair association, which is a declarative task, that really learning explicitly the association between different cards. And what he found, two interesting findings, I'll really summarize it briefly. One is that while the probabilistic task activated primarily the caudate, the declarative task, the pair association task, activated the mid-temporal areas. Furthermore, it's a point which I'm going to come back to, is he pointed out into the dynamics of the learning process, which is that the early phase of the procedural task, the mid-temporal areas were activated, and just through the training it switched, and the caudate started to be activated, and actually the mid-temporal areas were inhibited. So in a way, he concluded, I mean, just like Robertson and others, that these two systems not only are distinct, but maybe in a sense they are complementary or antagonistic. So when one is activated, the other is inhibited. Okay, now when we look into these two constructs, theoretical construct, we can see how easily people would reach conclusions. Just I Xerox some samples of titles, how people applied that or indicated that the basal ganglia is actually the key area that controls procedural memory. But although this dissociation, as I say, is very important, it led to in many aspects, in many ways, to a confusion. And I want to try to analyze or to bring up some questions. As I said, I'm going to be a little bit critical about the literatures, including my work, of course. When we look into the equation, we are all attempting to learn the relationship between brain and behavior. So on the one hand, on one side of this equation, we're trying to refine our measures, and we have the MEG, and we have over 100 electrodes using ERP. We have very powerful magnets and powerful software. So we're trying to increase the resolution of one side of this equation, of the brain measures. And my question is, are we making the same attempt in increasing the resolution in our behavioral measures? Because otherwise there will be a mismatch. If we're using crude measures on the behavioral side, there's no way that we're really going to tap and find the brain networks that subserve these cognitive processes. So let's look at I put it in a kind of a hierarchy. On the top we have a theoretical construct now, okay? We have declarative memory versus procedural memory. So all of us that we're trying to study, let's say, we're trying to ask which patient population is affected, I mean, what kind of memory process is affected with developmental dyslexia, with ADHD, with Parkinson, with Huntington, with TBI, whatever, traumatic brain injury. So we ask, okay, and the answer we expect to say, okay, the procedural memory is affected by ADHD, by developmental dyslexia. So we have all these nice titles. We ask questions about development. Is procedural learning, is age dependent in children, in aging? And then we ask about procedural memory, the brain regions that, again, that are involved in procedural memory. So the question is, when we are trying to answer these questions, at what level are we doing it, and how are we going to approach it? So first of all, which task we're going to choose. So let's go back. So we have a construct. We have eventually translated into specific tasks. So if we look at the task, I'm going to talk, Avi asked me to talk a little bit about declarative memory, so I'll be talking about it later. So if we look at about procedural memory tasks, there are many of them, just a brief list of mirror tracing, mirror reading, term for noise, reaction time, etc., etc. And the obvious question is, do we really believe that all these tasks tap exactly the same cognitive processes? That's definitely a very naive assumption. And yet, in one lab, a person might use a mirror tracing, on the other lab, somebody would use a serial reaction time. And from all these labs, the response will be, yes, procedural learning is preserved, procedural learning is, and still we're using totally different tools. I mean, it's quite obvious that mirror tracing, for example, has a very strong motor component. Mirror reading, it's a verbal and it's perceptual. Taurophanol is a problem-solving task. SRP, like finger building, there are sequence learning. So there's no doubt that in many ways all these tasks are very different. And it's quite simplistic to assume that they're tapping exactly the same theoretical construct. But I want to go even a step further and claim that even if I do focus in one task, there are still many various measures that we could generate from these tasks. And I'm going to demonstrate how the various measures actually represent different cognitive processes. So within, even if we stick to the same task, depending on which measure we're looking at, and different measures might give us a different response, a different picture. And I'm going to show you that. Furthermore, even when we extract the measure, we have to make sure that really this measure is a pure measure, because measure is not equal to memory process or cognitive process. We have to be aware that many of these measures are contaminated. And so if we're not careful with that, so it won't help us to have, I don't know, a magnet 7 Tesla or 20 Tesla. If the resolution on the other side of the equation is very crude, so we're going to lose the game. So let's take a tour. I'll start with the declarative memory. Because again, to do just a pair associate and say, okay, that represents declarative memory, or in Norton's task, just to ask about different cards and to say that represents declarative memory, again, it's very simplistic. So, let's start with declarative memory. I'll give you one or two examples, quick examples. So one of the tests which we are using in clinic as well is the Ray Auditory Verbal Learning Test, which I've adapted to Hebrew. And this test is basically based on 15 nouns which are read repeatedly for 5 consecutive tries. And then there is an interference list, and then recall, delay, recall, and recognition. So just to make it comparison of children with traumatic brain injury and controls, you can see that in some points of these different components of the task, there's almost no significant difference, but on other points, there are. For example, we could see here that immediate memory, for example, is preserved, but the learning rate is much steeper with the control group, okay? We can see that recognition is, the groups do not differ, but in recall they are different. By the way, when we compare recall versus recognition, we generate a measure of retrieval efficiency. So what I'm trying to say is that within the same test, we have various measures which reflect various processes. And for example, in a paper we've just was accepted recently for my lab, using this test, we were able to show that children with traumatic brain injury younger than 12 years old and older versus older, the older are much more impaired. If you're interested, you can look at the paper. But now we are able to actually look at various components of this, and now we're dealing with verbal learning memory. So we already restricted the whole issue, the whole concept of declarative memory to a very specific aspect of verbal learning, and still within verbal learning, you see how many various measures we could generate, and some of them are sensitive and others are not sensitive. So it would be too naive again and too misleading just to say, even saying that verbal memory is affected or is not affected. Okay, and let me just and take you even a step further. This is an old study of mine from, as you can see, 1983, which we compare closed head injury patient with closed head injury, and using the same task. And you see that different learning, their learning curves, and you see again that the controls have a steeper learning rate. Okay, the difference between first trial to fifth trial is increased as a function of training. So we could have concluded, okay, we have a measure of learning. I mean, we can generate, for example, trial 5 minus trial 1. That would be a measure which reflects the slope of the learning. And just say that, okay, that the closely injured patients have their learning rate is slower than that of control. But we try to analyze it further. So just to show that even when we have a measure, it's not a pure measure in terms of reflecting a cognitive process. So we make a dissociation between, we're assuming that if we started with 8 words on the first trial and then we moved to 11 words and then we moved to 13 words, we're assuming that the person learned 8 and then added 3 and then added 2, etc., etc. Well, that's again, it's a too simplistic assumption, because when we analyze how many words were added from trial to trial, we saw that basically the closely injured patients and the control groups were not so much different. I mean, there was a main effect, but there was no interaction, so that does not explain the learning difference. But when we looked at the number of words omitted from trial to trial, suddenly we saw the clear difference, that while the controls on average omit 1 word from trial to trial, the closely injured patient, as the learning process continues, I mean, they keep losing more and more words. So we have an explanation. We think that these words are not moving to long-term memory. But so now we started with a memory measure, which we thought that it's really very clean, but to show that it by itself could be broken down further. So if we look at memory, we could distinguish between acquisition and retention. Acquisition itself, memory span, the starting point and the learning rate, and then even within the learning rate, we could make a distinction between additions and omissions. So again, it shows you how we need to refine our measures. Now, I'm just going to take you through a few examples of neuroimaging studies, just to show that really, again, declarative memory is not a homogeneous construct. So let's say the Tulvin's model, the Hiram model of Tulvin, showing that encoding and retrieval are, again, activating different areas from the left and the right hemisphere, frontal lobe. Furthermore, it's modulated by the modality, whether it's words or faces. So again, encoding and retrieval, which area it activated, depending on the material, whether it's words or faces, and as you can see, it's a little bit of a mirror image of it, and again, as expected, faces go activating more the right hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and words activating the left hemisphere. And again, so the encoding and retrieval is in interaction with modality. Just 2 more examples. For example, Craig and Loka many years ago have introduced the term of depth of processing or levels of processing. And we know that if we ask a person to do kind of processing, shallow processing versus more deeper processing, for example, to which category these words belong, or how much do you like this word versus how many syllables are in this word, or vowels, etc. So memory is much better with deep encoding, but as we can see here, it activates slightly different brain area, and of course with deep encoding it activates frontal lobe. Based on the distinction or term source memory introduced by Shimamura and Yanowski and others, so we can have, that's a PET study like a Bezos, that if you present, for example, a list of words, and it depends what the question you're asking. If you're asking which word, okay, that's item recognition, so which one of these words appeared on the list, you'll be activating the mid-temporal areas. However, if you ask which word appeared later in the list, on the list, you'll be activating frontal lobe. That's source memory. And we know that patients with frontal lobe lesions have difficulties with source memory. So the same stimuli, it all depends on what is your question, that would activate different brain regions. So we have to be very careful about it. So the phase of learning is important, the instructions, the test is important, the retrieval pressure is important, the acquisition time, modality. So all this, so it would be, again, very naive just to say declarative memory as if it stands beyond all this. And believe me, that's a very short list of many more variables that affect our performance and actually activates different brain regions. Let's move to procedural memory. What I'm trying to demonstrate here that we have, I just touched upon several variables and show you how they affect performance, and we need to be careful when we analyze and the conclusions we reach when we apply. So I'm not going to talk about really examples of how different tasks yield different results. That's, I would say, too obvious, that if it involves verbal or it involves spatial tasks, if it's a perceptual or a cognitive task, a problem-solving task. I'm going to talk even in studies that use the same task, how various manipulations or various variables affect performance. As I say, it's a cautionary talk in terms of, to all of us, to be more careful about the conclusion and the choice we're making in choosing tasks and choosing measures. So let's go quickly through it. So let's start with the learning phase. There are many models, and of course from the cognitive literature, that the learning process, although we look at it as one process, but definitely a person goes through different phases which are mediated by different cognitive processes. So these are examples. I've used terms fast and slow. I mean, we could use all kinds of terminology. And we're not always careful when we analyze, which point at this learning phase are we reporting. So just to look at the whole learning as if it's one thing, that's, again, would not be correct. Let me just give you one example by Hubbard, who did functional MRI studies, and you can just have a quick look at how at different phases of the learning process, different brain areas are activated. There are studies by Schneider and Chain showing novice versus skilled individuals on various skills, how at the initial stage the frontal lobes is activated and how gradually it is less activated. So are we really careful when we talk about the learning to say at which phase are we analyzing? Or we're just treating the whole learning phase as if it is one unitary thing, which is, as you can see, is definitely not accurate. Another distinction which I made, I think, was 1997 between baseline learning versus learning phase. I found, let's say, with the aging literature that are contradicting conclusions, inconsistent conclusions, and when I looked at it, and I saw that some of the researchers were talking that overall the elderly are performing worse, others were talking about the learning curve. So we took several tasks, but I'm going to show you just the results of the Tower of Hanoi. The Tower of Hanoi, if you don't know, the discs, several discs, 3, 4, 5, and you ask to move the disc from this pole to this pole, moving one disc at a time, and not allowed to place a larger disc on a smaller disc. So for 3 discs, it takes 7 moves, 4 it takes 15, and 5 it takes 31 moves. It has a recursory rule here. And what we found with elderly, again, the baseline was impaired. So they started at a higher level. They require more time and more moves. But the learning rate, the change over time is the same. And similarly, we reported with a traumatic brain injury patient, whether you measure number of moves or time per move, you can see that the learning slope is not different from that of controls, but the baseline is different. Interestingly, we also manipulated, I'm going to come back to this point again from a different angle, divided attention. And again, what we found, the divided attention, which presumably engages the frontal lobes, affects the baseline of performing the Tower of Hanoi, but doesn't affect the learning rate. And one word maybe, that it is quite consistent that I could say that the frontal lobes probably with the Tower of Hanoi determines that your starting point. I mean, it's not a coincidence that in neuropsychological assessment, the Tower of Hanoi is used as a measure of executive functions. So if you administer it once, that really reflects frontal lobe functioning, but apparently it's independent on the learning rate. So these are two dissociable measures. And so when a person reports he was impaired on performing the Tower of Hanoi, I mean, what aspect? They both could have started at the same point and have different learning rates, or start at different points and have similar learning rates. It's totally different profiles. Something that you're going probably to hear more about it today, the whole issue of transfer and interference. But just look at the serial reaction time task, which is again a very, very, very popular task. I mean, last time I looked, it was almost 2,000 citations. Nissen and Bulliger's original paper introducing the serial reaction time task, which is a very good task, and I've been using it in my lab for many years. And in this task, actually, there is a sequence of positions, and the person has to press the corresponding key. Now, unlike the finger opposing task, the subject here is unaware of the fact that there is a repeated sequence. Now we are careful to have 12 sequence in length of 12 positions to have it balanced ongoingly. But so the person is repeatedly pressing the key. We find a low a power function, and the reaction time decreases. Now, and what was reported by Nissen and others, here is an example with Korsakoff patients, that although again we see the dissociation between baseline and learning rate, baseline performance was higher. I mean, the reaction time was slower, but the learning rate was the same, and they added a random block to show that it's really the sequence that is learned, and there is a cost here, and the cost was not different, significantly different between patients with amnesic, in this case amnesic. Well, I won't go into the problem of considering Korsakoff patients as amnesics. I mean, that causes a lot of troubles to the literature. It's a very messy group, but I won't dwell on it. But anyway, you can see here that they are preserved, and on the other side, again, the dissociation, although it's a different lab, using the same task, you can see that patients with Parkinson's disease are not aware of, the reaction time of the change of sequence. So while the control group have a real cost, it slows down the reaction time, patients with Parkinson's disease are really not affected by it, which was interpreted as indicating that they did not learn the sequence. By the way, we have shown that with patients with pure basal ganglia lesions, very similar results, even more dramatic, I think, that they are really continue to increase. The performance continues to reduce reaction time, while with the change of sequence and controls, they have this cost. But let me analyze it for a second again. So when we look at the learning rate, that's learning. Now, with change of sequence, the controls did not go all the way up, and the question is why. So, in the literature, the acceptable explanation is that apparently this learning process, this reduction from 800 to, 570 or so, reduction in reaction time is composed of at least two things. One is really sequence learning, and the other is some kind of a more general, something more general that the person has learned. probably in this case, the association between, or eye coordination between the key, choosing the exact finger and the exact position on the screen. So this coordination takes a while to learn, and that's the game that we can find also with patients with Parkinson's disease. So the learning, the overall game is composed. So this measure, if we have looked at this measure as a learning measure, that would be, again, a crude measure, a contaminated measure, and this is a pure measure, which we need to calculate. Now, we showed in some of our studies that it depends if you change it to random or you change to a different sequence. There are several things which are learned. Let me just quickly show you a recent study that we used with eye trackers. We just submitted it. And now we're using oculomotor activated reaction time. So the person, that's a region of interest, and if the person fixates it for 100 milliseconds, that activates it. So we don't need the manual response, so it's enough to see it. Okay, if you want to just go ahead a quick, work? Does it work? No, okay, forget it. The findings are that here's the manual curve, which is the typical manual curve that we see, manually activated, okay, across, and here's the oculomotor activated. Now, maybe we don't notice, but when you look at it, you can see that here we replicate the previous result, which that is that the cost doesn't go all the way back to baseline, but there is a general component and a sequence component. But here, with the oculomotor activated, it goes all the way back to baseline. So that indicates to us, or at least that's our interpretation, that it's a pure measure of sequence learning, because unlike the manual version of the task, the movement of the eyes to a stimulus is something which is pre-learned, and you don't need to learn it in the lab. So when you change a sequence, you go all the way. So it's a much cleaner measurement, and I think that's what we have to do. So let's just go quickly through some examples. For the issue of modality, again, I'm showing you within the same paradigm. That's a study by my doctoral students, Gabay. It was published 3 years ago. So when we use the serial reaction time, the motor sequence with children with developmental dyslexia, we saw a normal pattern, and I'll talk about it in a second. But the interesting thing, when we use letters instead of spatial positions, they behave just like the Parkinson's patients. So they are really don't have any cost to change of sequence. So here, the same task, you use verbal material, they are impaired. You use spatial material, they are preserved. Another dissociation which we demonstrated is between perceptual and conceptual. When we used mirror reading and gave divided attention tasks at the same time, it did not really affect mirror reading. Whether repeated words, non-repeated words, it was really, the subjects were not affected by divided attention. And mirror reading, of course, is one of the tasks used as a reflecting procedural memory. But this slide I've shown you before, when we use the Tau of Hanon, which is a Neurocognitive task, it affected, although it did not affect the learning rate, it affected the baseline. And online and offline learning, again, you're going to hear a lot about it, and then just mention, again, from Gabay's doctoral work, that these figures are not really so good. But anyway, the learning rate there was an interaction here between the developmental dyslexic and controls, but in terms of offline learning, there was no difference. So again, a dissociation between what is learned, so maybe we're assuming there is a kind of a hidden learning which is not reflected in reaction time, which is an interesting thing. And the other interesting thing is when we applied the divided attention, we found an interesting, really unexpected finding that it's improved even the offline learning. Divided attention improved offline learning. One of our interpretations is that somehow it cleaned maybe the declarative component, so it created even better offline learning. But here, it did not affect the same way the developmental dyslexic children. So again, so in other words, what I'm trying to show here, that each measure tells us a slightly different story. So we have to be very careful of what we conclude. And just to conclude, a very recent paper with Avi on Taro Hanoi in patient with Parkinson's disease. Again, I'm not going to go into details of this study, but it's really repeated trials where we wanted to make sure that their problem is not because they were not given sufficient training. The very interesting finding was that their problem, I mean, they retained, when we trained them 18 times each session, 3 sessions, and 6 months later. And the interesting finding is that they learn, they preserve the learning when you compare it to control, etc. However, they settle in a, we call it a suboptimal level. And they stop improving at a certain level, but what they learn, they have preserved. And that corresponds very well with the literature with monkeys. But my point here is even more important. That's the number of moves. But when you look at the time per move, they almost perform just like controls. So again, which ones telling us the truth? The answer is both of them are true. But we have to understand what each one of these measures reflects. So in conclusion, what I was trying to convey to you in this talk is that the dissociation between declarative and procedural is really well established and worthwhile. By the way, maybe one of the most consistent findings is that global amnesic patients, I mean not all kind of amnesia, but really global amnesic patients probably are impaired, performance in all these list of tasks, of procedural tasks, I mean, there are many studies that are preserved, and probably, regardless of the nature of the declarative tasks, they are impaired. But if we go into more refined with patients with different, slightly different damages, then it's more complicated. So, in order to understand the complexity of the neural networks observing procedural memory, there is a need to refine the behavioral measures reflecting the basic learning processes. And that would lead to a more comprehensive understanding of the theoretical construct of procedural memory. Thank you.
Thank you. One quick question. If there will be time at the end, we'll be open for discussion. One quick question.
Thank you, Karni. It's a nice talk. I was really interested in your oculometer task. Did you look at consolidation with this particular task?
No, unfortunately not yet.
Because
but
it's really actually great to have a look at it because of all the problems we have been talking about with this warm-up processes that we have when we start over, so during the test on day 2. And so here it seems that it's cleaner.
yes.
So that you don't have this kind of problem. It would be a good way to see.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I was telling you, Julian, before that we have, I didn't elaborate on it, but we have a slide in between it for 500 milliseconds in which we could actually measure the movements towards the next position. So we have a direct measure of anticipation. So, and we're working on that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.